All right, so the next section we're going to talk about is just we're going to do a quick history of kind of what we call the desegregation time period, particularly starting with Brown versus Board, but really I mean with a decade before with FDR and Truman and different various court cases, slowly kind of breaking apart Jim Crow, and it really came together in 1954 with Brown versus Board, and just continued, up until 1968 with Fair Housing Act, and really peaked up into the 80s before we start seeing kind of a resegregation period from the 80s up until the present. But during this time period, from like the 40s to the 70s and 80s, there was a real there was a lot of movement in desegregation. So we're going to kind of just cover that really quickly, talk about what happened. But it's important to understand that in this time period that there's these two polar opposite forces that are fighting, that are in many ways still fighting and playing out today. On one side you have this civil rights movements, particularly in the 50s and 60s. There was a huge civil rights movement that NAACP blew up their membership, all these new organizations, SNCC and Dr. King and Malcolm X and all these, it was just explosion of civil rights. But fighting for desegregation, fighting for integration, and for civil rights. So, and on the other side, you had this massive, what we could literally call massive resistance, this massive white resistance to, particularly to, focused on desegregation, but also continuing to focus on civil rights for Black people. And you see this play out, oftentimes violently. You see this play out. You're looking at this photo right now. I mean, this is playing out where you literally have Black children at these. This is a school in Nashville, and you have elementary school children being just terrorized by white protesters. And we're going to talk more about this in the next chapter, the white resistance. But you see these two forces fighting, and in many ways these forces are still with us today. Like we still have the Black Lives Matter movement, and many other George Floyd protests, and many other movements today are extensions of these civil rights movements. And at the same time you have you have organizations like the modern Republican Party was really created in the 50s and 60s by harnessing this white resistance for political power, and you see that continuing to happen to this day. And at the same time you see infrastructures such as like school choice that was created through this resistance as a way to a strategy to continue segregation. You still see that playing out in different de facto ways and today. So so this is important for us to understand the creation of these two forces, because these two forces are still battling today for this country. So but it really, what really began the dismantling of at least de jure segregation. For most part, we're talking about de jure, like Jim Crow. De facto, continued for many decades, and in many ways still continues today. But for de jure segregation, particularly Jim Crow, and for one, that became a propaganda tool during World War II. Particularly, we were, America's, U.S. is trying to sell this war, that we need to defeat the evil fascism of Nazi Germany and the fascists and anti-democratic people, and all these evil people. But at the same time, what we learned previously, a lot of these evil entities, I guess, Nazis, they learned a lot from Jim Crow, and how we treated Black people in this country. And so in many ways that was, they used that as propaganda against us, to make, show us that we were the kind of the evils of the world. People like FDR and Truman saw that, as not only as embarrassment to this country, but also as a propaganda tool to and during a time where we were trying to become this world power. I mean, particularly after World War II finished, we tried to become. We tried to build democracies and rebuild countries, in good and bad ways, so we were trying to be like the hegemony of the world and trying to, one of the world powers, but at the same time we had this like, horrible existence of Jim Crow, that it was really hard to sell democracy when we were denying so many people democracy in our own country. So that really what was, set off FDR and Truman to start, or start slowly dismantling Jim Crow. So I'm gonna read this passage Judith Goldstein wrote. She writes, even after the Allied victory in 1945, a victory strongly dependent on the ideology of liberation, the status quo in the racist South seemed relatively safe and intact. Southern blacks went back to living in the despotic world of Jim Crow, as well as crippling discrimination and hostility in the North. The black population was still mainly based in the South, although vast numbers had moved to find jobs in the industrial North and Midwest in the 30s during the war. In fact, discrimination persisted and even intensified nationwide when black veterans were denied the generous federal benefits to education, housing, and medical care that were bestowed upon white veterans, says the GI bills. In 1948, President Truman presented the country with a stark disparity between American ideals and the reality of race in America, especially in the South. In the country that became home to the United Nations, driven by America's idealistic war and post-war aims, the president tried to act. He asked Congress to enact civil rights legislation to break the hold of Jim Crow, to end wanton killings by lynching, erase state laws and local practices that kept blacks from voting, and prevent discrimination and segregation in work and travel. No American president had ever taken such a bold initiative. Not all groups are free to live and work, Truman wrote, where they please or to improve their conditions of life by their own efforts. Not all groups enjoy the full privileges of citizenship. The federal government has a clear duty to see that the constitutional guarantees of individual liberties and of equal protections under the laws are not denied or abridged anywhere in the Union. The Southern-dominated Congress blocked his proposals. So even though he presented all this, these civil rights bills and legislation, and they were blocked, I mean, he still did some executive orders, particularly one where he desegregated the military, and that really, that began this, not only this dismantling of Jim Crow, but also of white resistance from the Dixiecrats and Strom Thurmond. They really recognized, the dangers of Jim Crow to the Jim Crow, and really started beginning, the resistance to desegregation. So this quick timeline. I mean, just highlighting some of the more important events victories for desegregation. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more that I didn't include, but these were some of the bigger ones. But really, like I said, desegregation really begins, during and after World War II, when we realized that, where parts of our government that wanted to be, this like world power, this voice for democracy, realized we couldn't do that when we were, denying so many people, black people at home, their right to democracy and civil rights. At the same time, in the 40s and 50s, we see this explosion of the NAACP organization membership, where they just blow up to hundreds of thousands of people, and they really started out in the early 1900s, in 20s and 30s, like working on anti-lynching campaigns and working on violence against women campaigns, black women in particular. That's where like Rosa Parks and a lot of people got their start, and really built out this network. But particularly around the 50s, they start using this network or a lot of people like Dr. King start coming in the scene and start using this network to just organize this massive civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. So that was happening. At the same time, on the federal level, we start seeing FDR executive order. He prohibits racial discrimination from any of the defense industries and contractors that we use to build our weapons. I mean, they wouldn't buy from people that didn't hire people or discriminated in any way. We saw in 1944 white primaries. White primaries was this thing where, and particularly in the South, where they would basically say only white people could participate in the primaries. So even if a black person was able to vote in an election, his only options were these super racist candidates that white people picked in white only primaries. So that was outlawed in 1944, and we start seeing the Supreme Court kind of weighing in on calling interstate travel, segregated interstate travel, unconstitutional. Mendez versus Westminster School District. This is a California case. This is basically the Brown versus Board of Education for Latino students. California at the time was grossly segregated with its Latinx population and with and particularly in schools. Latinx students went to horrific schools in California, and eventually a parent sued and then went all the way to the Supreme Court and then was ruled unconstitutional, and that kind of set things in motion for eventually the Brown versus Board education. But right after the Mendez versus Westminster case, then Truman signs executive order where he basically desegregates the military. That 1948 was a really big year because that's really where like the Dixiecrats and the Strom Thurmond and all them start walking. They walk out and they start in the Dixiecrat party and they really try to they try to create this new party against desegregation, and they didn't win much, but I mean they won a lot of votes. They didn't win many states, but they won a lot of votes in the South, and then later they returned to the Democrats and continued fighting desegregation from the Democrat Party. Then and eventually by 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, many of them switched parties, and that's where the modern Republican Party is really founded on a lot of these Dixiecrats that were looking to harness white opposition to desegregation. And then we have Brown versus Board, which basically rules. This is really important. A lot of people, I think most people know about Brown versus Board education case, but they don't know the very specific part where Brown versus Board of Education basically outlaws segregation in schools, but more importantly it deems separate but unequal. If you remember Plessy versus Ferguson, Supreme Court had said that it was constitutional to have separate but equal facilities. What Brown versus Board did is they proved Thurgood Marshall and then NAACP proved that separate but equal was it was unconstitutional. Separate so and that's really important to understand, because we see this happen a lot, and even today, Montgomery County is this county in Maryland that is right next to DC, just had this rezoning commission and all these community meetings where they're basically figured out all these white schools were overcrowded, and then they have all these black schools that were undercrowded but were under resourced. So they came up with an integration plan where they would start mixing students, black and white students in these different schools. And the white parents a lot of white parents went nuts. They didn't want to do it. They just protested. They're super angry. But they pushed this plan that basically said, well, instead of integrating, can't you just, give black schools the decent, can't you just fund these schools equally? Give black schools enough funds so that they'll have a, good school in their neighborhood, and we'll stay in our school with our neighborhood, and on the outside that may seem like, oh, that could work, but the reality is, there you can look at any school district and you'll never find a black school with equal funding and with a white school. It just doesn't exist in this country. So even if you try to do that, it wouldn't happen. But two, what Brown versus Board has recognized that if you do this, and even if you're able to do this and you're able to have a black school and a white school that's equally funded, what they realize is without integration, that black school is still going to, be discriminated against. It's still going to be unequal in multiple different ways, whether that's additional, funding to power to, all these different things. It's just, it does not create equality. And that's important to understand because today, a lot of people are still pushing this, they're pushing this idea that we just need to fund these schools um, equally instead of desegregating it. And that's important to understand that that is unconstitutional. But then when they passed Brown versus Board of Education, in '54, all the people in the South were basically like, yeah, whatever. So they in '55, the Supreme Court got back together again and basically added more directives, particularly this directive that says this needs to happen as soon as possible with all deliberate speed. That was like the Brown 2 of Supreme Court is trying to add more directives that would because they realized they didn't really say a whole lot, and the South wasn't going to do anything about it. So they added new directives to push this along. And then same year, '55 is when the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and that lasts a year and essentially creates these court cases that goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, declares that Alabama bus laws are unconstitutional. And that's not just important legally, but also this was huge because at the same time in the '50s, all TVs are becoming a thing, so all these people are seeing this bus boycott, for a whole year, and white people are being introduced to this idea of desegregation and and what it means. And then 1960, the Bonton versus Virginia. This is really important because this basically is another Supreme Court case that rules that segregated buses are unconstitutional. But again, at the same time, the South was like, yeah, whatever. We're not going to enforce it, so it doesn't mean anything. So that's when freedom riders were created. These were like the most courageous civil rights people you can think of. They basically got on buses, integrated buses, and drove through the South and just got attacked and firebombed and beat up. But at the same time, they forced, they caused so much brutality against themselves that they forced JFK and the Kennedys to start enforcing the Bonton versus Virginia law and start enforcing desegregation in the South. And then moving on, 1964, the Civil Rights Act, this is LBJ brings this together after, Kennedy, JFK is assassinated. And, this was, only LBJ. He has, say what you want about LBJ. He did a lot of good things and did a lot of horrible things, but, it's hard to imagine anyone else, passing the Civil Rights Act. They have whole movies on how he was able to politically push that through. But he got that passed with basically outlaw de jure, or Jim Crow segregation. So it's just like a snap of fingers, all of a sudden Jim Crow was outlawed. Unfortunately, they left a lot of loopholes for de facto segregation that we're going to talk about in a second. And then '65, we have the Voting Rights Act that outlawed, the basically Jim de jure voting suppression, but again, left a lot of loopholes we'll talk about. And then '68, the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited discrimination in sale and rentals of housing. This was, supposedly was supposed to outlaw redlining. It wasn't officially outlawed for another decade, but it outlawed all different kinds of discriminatory, housing practices. So that was like the three big civil rights acts, that we talk about in the '60s. So '64, the Civil Rights Act outlawed Jim Crow, then they outlawed voter suppression, and then housing discrimination. So, basically by '68, all the forms of de jure, racial discrimination and segregation were unconstitutional or declared unconstitutional. Whether that's, schools, school systems, housing, businesses, voting, military, immigration, all this stuff. because there was immigration acts as well in the 60s that outlawed, like different kinds of racist quotas and things. So we start seeing this explosion in the 60s of civil rights, by law, at least. At the same time, we'll talk about this later. A lot of these, I mean, they didn't really address past harms. They didn't really address racial wealth gaps and things like that. They just said, oh, that was bad and we're not going to do that again. So we're going to talk more about why we're still feeling the effects of that. But that, had this like golden era of, up until, for the next, 5 years or so, up until about 1973. The Supreme Court was, and the government, and was on board and enforcing, desegregation, enforcing these rules, and we saw, significant, accomplishments. Eventually the South, started desegregating, under court orders. Eventually we start seeing, even in the North and the West, we start seeing, busing initiatives and different desegregation initiatives that really are effective. Even though we'll talk about, I mean, we sell this narrative that they weren't effective, but they were actually really effective, up until like the 80s. That's really where desegregation peaks, and then we start seeing a return to resegregation, and that has a lot to do with with white resistance, with other different measures, but a lot of this had to do with the Supreme Court. Basically, Nixon and Reagan judges, they put on a lot of judges. That's what, like, I mean, if you look at, who's picked the majority of our Supreme Court judges since LBJ, and it's been majority conservative. And Nixon and Reagan picked some really, really anti-civil rights, is the best way to say it. Anti-civil rights, judges who basically spent the next, decades, starting after about 673, passing these precedents that basically made it impossible to enforce a lot of this, these civil rights acts. A lot of it, creating this idea of proof of malice, that you can, that you literally need to have, proof, like someone writing, saying out loud, I'm doing this to hurt people, to actually enforce a lot of discrimination acts and stuff. And they just spent the next like 10, 20 years just kind of dismantling a lot of this. I'll read this one quote from Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who wrote Racism Without Racists. He says, both the Nixon and Reagan administrations, with support of the Berger and Rehnquist Supreme Courts, executed significant tasks to crush the promise embedded in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to contain and neutralize the victories of the Civil Rights Movement by painting a picture of a colorblind, equal opportunity society whose doors were now wide open. If only African Americans would take the initiative and walk through. So, they painted this picture of basically like, okay, we outlawed all, discrimination. So now if Black people are still struggling, that's because they're just not taking their own, taking the initiative. And that is still, kind of like the narrative that the political right pushes till this day. When in reality, these laws were great and these court cases were great, but they in no way, dismantled white supremacy, dismantled our racial hierarchy, or fixed any past harms. All right, so I want to talk just a little bit about civil rights movement. We're going to talk a lot more about the civil rights movement during the policing class, because that's that's an important part of the history of policing, is the history of the civil rights movement. But I just want to talk just a little bit about just how, on scale this was. Manny Marble wrote, in 3 difficult years, the Southern struggle had grown from a modest group of Black students demonstrating that one lunch counter to the largest mass movement for racial reform and civil rights in the 20th century. So, I mean, the civil rights movement, I mean, the whole thing, you could say started from 1954 to 68, even though it's hard to frame. I mean, the civil rights movement has been something that's been, started since, abolitionists in this country. I mean, it's been started for a long time beforehand, but what we can generally consider the civil rights movement is 54, Brown versus Board, up to 68, the Fair Housing Act. But really, we consider it peaking really in the early 60s, particularly, in 1963. But between 61 and 63, we just see, massive protests all across this country, particularly in the South. We see 20,000 people arrested. In 1963 alone, 15,000 people were arrested. This was an interesting fact I found, and a lot of this stuff, it was kind of hard to find statistics. So some of this stuff is, take it for what it will. But I did find, a DOJ report that Department of Justice that talks about just the 10 weeks before King's "I Have a Dream" speech. There were 758 demonstrations in 186 cities, resulting in 14,000, over 14,000 arrests. And what's important about this is at the same time, because a lot of time, most of the country at this point is extremely segregated, all over the country. And particularly in the North and the West, most white people don't interact with Black people. So instead they absorb all this white supremacy narratives and stereotypes and implicit biases, and they're told that Jim Crow is working fine, but then all of a sudden they all get TVs in their house, and then part of the strategy of the civil rights movement was to record this brutality, to actually encourage this brutality and then record it and show it to people, to, not just white people all over the country, but also powerful white people like the Kennedys, who even though they were president, he was president, and his brother was, I forget what position, but pretty high up there. They have very little understanding that in the early 60s of what it was like to live under Jim Crow. But then all of a sudden this whole, everyone sees the brutality. Everyone sees Bull Conder and all these white sheriffs and these white, these police just brutalizing, children, sicking dogs on children. And that really, blew up, particularly in 1963, the Birmingham campaign. So that's, where we had sit-ins and marches and protests. A lot of people consider this like the turning point. Just a year later, the 64, civil rights bill outlawed Jim Crow, just because there was so much brutality. Not only that, it was bombings. There was, the 4 girls died in that church. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But there was just so much violent white resistance to this. But even during this time, we see 2,500, 2,500 people. Many of them children were arrested. There was a Birmingham Children Crusade where there was children that would just march, for against Jim Crow, and then we met with police brutality and fire hoses, and all of this was being captured on TV. If I saw one poll that actually pulled before Birmingham campaign, like in 1960, there was only 4% of Americans thought the civil rights was a pressing issue. But after they saw the footage of Birmingham campaign, over half, saw this as a very pressing, needs to be fixed. And again, like I said, a year later, they outlawed Jim Crow on a federal level. I just want to give a little bit of context of the size of this, because even though a lot of us weren't alive during this time period, most of us, all of us were alive last year, hopefully, who couldn't, understood that. Who witnessed, the George Floyd protests, when George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer on camera, lying on ground, and the cop was literally, just, had his knee into the guy's neck for 8 minutes until he died. That set off, protests, across the world, for that lasted, most of the summer. And a lot of people consider this, not an individual act, but extension of a bigger, civil rights movement. It really began with the Black Lives Matter movement, and in 2013 and 14, with particularly with Ferguson, in 2014, and the protests against police brutality there. Just looking at this past summer, between May 26th to August 20, again, it's hard to find statistics on this stuff, but there was 14,000 plus arrests in that time period, of demonstrations across the world, over in 2,000 cities. But really, where most of the more kind of, I guess, hardcore demonstrations, the more, the city, that met police resistance and police brutality, was in about 200 cities. About 200 cities imposed curfews, and imposed curfews to create a justification to start, fighting. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes imposed that to create this justification, start arresting and brutalizing activists. and at that point, the vast majority of the protests, upper, like 93% was peaceful, but there was a lot of violent protests as well, a lot of rioting that did do a significant amount of damage. Even though like the political right sells us as like entire cities were burning, when in fact it was just these relocated to these small blocks where oftentimes where the high there's a lot of police brutality, and but it was a decent amount of destruction. And a lot of people, will try to say, oh, they should be more like the 60s, and be peaceful. But there was a lot of riots as well in the 60s during the civil rights movements. I mean, there would be usually peaceful protests that were often met with, police brutality. And then afterwards there would be riots. And so it was, this is just a reality. I mean, Dr. King talked about this a lot, that, the riots are a language of, of the press. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, he talked a lot about that, and that that you can't, yeah, you can't victim blame people for rioting against their own oppression. So, but I just wanted to put that in there as a context of just, in many ways, this was, on par with what was happening, in the 60s, 50s, and the 60s. So, and I would say the events in Birmingham, this is President Kennedy. So President Kennedy actually, this was supposed to be the photo that kind of like pushed him to act when he saw this. I forget the name of the guy, but he saw him being attacked by police dogs. And then that's when he said, events in Birmingham have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. And that's when he really starts pushing his Civil Rights Act. But unfortunately, he gets killed later, and then LBJ kind of picks it up and brings it home. But I want to talk about a little bit, there's a difference between desegregation and integration. And this is really important to understand because the goal ultimately is integration. Even though we talk about desegregation a lot, and a lot of times that it seems to be the goal for a lot of things, but I think what we're learning now is desegregation, things like diversity, just increasing your diversity does not mean there is equality or you're eliminating discrimination. So desegregation is a legal or political process of ending separation and isolation of different racial and ethnic groups achieved through court order or voluntary means. So that desegregation is basically just ending segregation. It's basically saying like these schools are going to be open, to Black and white kids. Doesn't mean they're going to be treated equally. It doesn't mean they're all going to, yeah, you're all going to learn curriculum that is appropriate to racially appropriate, or they're going to be taught by teachers that are trained in racial equity. I mean, it just means that we're just adding diversity, but we're starting to realize diversity alone doesn't do a whole lot, and that's where we really need, the ultimate goal needs to be integration. Integration is kind of taking it a step further. It's looking at it's basically saying, well, how do we actually create equality, not just diversity, but equality. So it's a social process in which members of different racial and ethnic groups experience fair and equal treatment within a desegregated environment. So William Raspberry writes this, segregation, by now generally recognized as an evil thing, is the arbitrary separation of people on the basis of race. Desegregation is simply the ending of that practice. Integration is the reverse of desegregation. The legitimate goal is to end discrimination, not some arbitrary admix of salt and pepper. And we're going to see this a lot. I think with the next slide, yeah, we're going to see this a lot with this idea that there's a lot of schools today that are desegregated, are very diverse, but at the same time, they treat Black and white kids completely different. Black kids are punished harsher and more quicker, more expelled, quicker. White kids are kind of corralled into gifted programs. If you look at a lot of these diverse schools, the gifted programs are almost entirely white, and that's very intentional. Based on how they gauge, they use racist tests that we'll talk about, and standardized testing and things like that to kind of help them get into these programs that are often more well funded. You also have teachers. Majority of teachers are white, and majority of them do not are not trained in racial equality. So you have, a lot of times we have these, diverse, schools, these desegregated schools that are still in many ways continuing, de facto segregation, and treating, black and white kids differently. So it's important to if we want to get to, this integration, we need to go beyond just simple diversity. I'm going to try something new with our classes. I'm going to try to incorporate a podcast, this is going to be kind of similar to when there's like a copyright video and you have to pause the presentation and actually go to the website of the podcast and to listen to and I'll outline, like the episodes and the time periods and things. But I thought that would be easier than to actually play the podcast and record it, which would just make get a little bit confusing. So we're going to try this out in the first podcast. We're actually going to listen to a couple clips from this podcast throughout this course, but I'm just going to start out with a couple short ones from episode 4 of Nice White Parents. If you haven't checked out Nice White Parents, it's an amazing podcast. It's a 5 episodes long, about an hour each episode, and it's really about de facto school segregation. Modern day. There's a lot of history to it. We'll be listening to some of the history throughout this class, but it's really focused on New York City, schools, which New York City is one of the most segregated school systems in the country, and it's a powerful presentation, particularly like if you happen to be white and liberal, and sometimes can feel like consciously or subconsciously that this whole racism thing is a conservative Southern kind of thing. But this is a great example of how very well-intentioned liberal white parents who believe in integration are actually responsible for continuous segregation through our schools. So I definitely recommend checking out when you have a second. We're gonna have 5 hours. Check out the whole series. But for now, I just want to kind of build on this idea of difference between desegregation and integration, and difference between equality and equity, and diversity and integration. So there's 2 segments. So if you go to Nice White Parents, if you Google that, or go to you can listen to the New York Times website or Apple Podcasts. Go to episode 4, and you can fast forward to these 2 time periods. Just a couple minutes each, but it just talks about, it gives some good references of the difference between equality and equity, and diversity and integration. And I want to read these 2 passages really quickly, just that I pulled from these clips. But the first one is about it's a charter school in New York City called Success, and the narrator says, equality means everyone gets the same thing. Equity means everyone gets what they need. Success is equal. Everyone is treated the same, but kids are never all the same. Some kids are chatty in the hallway, or need a minute to think before answering a question. Some kids have $1,000,000 at home, and some kids don't. A black girl might respond differently than a white girl to being reprimanded by a white teacher. A single parent with 2 jobs might have a harder time getting their kids to school on time than, say, a stay-at-home mom with a partner. So it really talks about this difference. But equality is, we're just going to treat everyone the same. But I mean, everyone's not coming at the same place to the table. Everyone doesn't have the same backgrounds, doesn't isn't treated the same in society, doesn't have the same amount of wealth and opportunity. So so that's why equity is important. Because equity, just ensures that everyone's getting what their needs. Some people need more, some people need different, accommodations. Some people don't need much at all. But equity just ensures that everyone has a chance to be successful, and that's really what we're going for. Same with versus diversity versus integration. I'll read this last quote, and this is more about an international school, studies school, Boreum Hill. They call it BHS in New York City as well. And they talk about they have these really great integration plan that goes beyond diversity. They talk a lot about how they schools used to a lot of people used to think that what we needed was diversity, but we've quickly found out we can have the most diverse situation and the most diverse school, and still have discrimination, still fail to be integrated. And that's really true when you look at a lot of schools that actually look integrated, that are actually desegregated, that are very diverse. Oftentimes they're still very very segregated schools. Oftentimes, white kids get crowded into the gifted programs based on standardized testing, and we'll talk more about that and how that oftentimes discriminates depending on your opportunities and backgrounds. Many times, even if you're in a diverse school, black kids are treated differently, are reprimanded easier, given harsher punishments, expelled easier. White kids are treated differently. Majority of teachers are in this country are white, and a lot of them don't have much experience with racial justice. So these teachers are creating different situations and environments. So it's important to understand that it's not just like we're not just looking for a diverse situation, we're looking for an integrated situation. So when I say it's a great quote: diversity is not the goal. Having a diverse school does not mean we have an integrated school. We need to work on that to get an integrated school. So this time, if you want to hit pause, go to one of these websites, just listen to just 2-minute bit here and 3-minute there, and then come back, and we'll continue with this presentation. All right, so hopefully everyone checked out the Nice White Parents, a few clips, and they're starting to get an understanding of that they're, the difference between, what we're, equity and equality and diversity and, integration and things like that. And on top of that, this is a great time to kind of talk about the three big civil rights bills in the 60s that came out of this, desegregation and civil rights movements. And it's really important that we understand, how important these bills were, but also the limitations of these bills. Because a big narrative today is that these bills, particularly on the political right, that they push this narrative that these civil rights bills fixed everything, and there's no more discrimination, there's no more cause or harm, and now it's if black people are struggling, it's because they choose to struggle now, and so we shouldn't continue with affirmative action, we shouldn't continue with racial justice or reparations or anything like that. Mitch McConnell, during 2019's reparations discussions, and I think it was in the Senate committee, had said that why do we need reparations? We have these three civil rights bills, everything's fixed, and that's a false narrative. It's very intentional narrative to try to defund social programs and any kind of effort for racial equality. And if we dive a little bit deeper, we can see that these bills outlawed the de jure, the explicit racism, but in many ways protected and perpetuated kind of the implicit, the race neutral racism. We talk a lot about race neutral racism, and that's oftentimes what we're dealing with today. Is it doesn't feel like racism. No one's intending it to be racist, or at least they're not explicitly saying out loud that it's intended to be racist. But yet there's racist outcomes, and that's what we're seeing a lot today. For example, in 1964, the Civil Rights Bill that outlawed Jim Crow, that outlawed de jure discrimination. You can't, specifically, discriminate against anything. You can't force black people in different schools and different water fountains and different hospitals and things like that. But at the same time, it did not deal with a lot of issues. It didn't deal with de facto segregation. So for example, if the communities were already segregated based on previous history and policies, then that that was okay. We can continue this unequal funding of schools and continue this segregation. They even included this thing called because of the North, why a lot of people signed on this bill when they didn't really want segregation in their own communities in the North and West, because they thought they geared this to just basically punish the South and then punish Jim Crow. But they even put legislation provisions in the legislation to protect northern desegregation and western desegregation, and particularly with this loophole called racial imbalance, which this says is Title IV of the Civil Rights Act says desegregation means the assignment of students to public schools and within such schools without regard to their race, color, religion, or national origin, but desegregation shall not mean the assignment of students to public schools in order to overcome racial imbalance. So that basically says if there is a pre-existing racial imbalance, which there is, we are a very segregated country because of centuries of Jim Crow and white supremacy. So if there's a pre-existing racial imbalance, desegregation can't really do much about that. The 1964 Civil Rights Bill can't really force these communities in the North or in the West to start desegregating, because that's just how things are, or at least the narrative that they sell. So in many ways, the civil rights, it was great. It outlawed Jim Crow, the 64 bill, but at the same time, it continued and even protected a lot of de facto racism and de facto discrimination and segregation. And at the same time, it did not address at all any past harm. I mean, it basically just said, all right, we realized that this was harmful and it caused a lot of pain and suffering, but we're just going to stop doing it and then continue forward. And when in reality, there was this huge racial wealth gap. Black people were living in horrific, concentrated poverty because of, desegregation, or segregation, Jim Crow, and white supremacy. But it was just like, oh well, we're just going to move forward. So it was, it was a good bill, but it really failed on, it was very limited on what it could do. And then in '65, we got the Voting Rights Act, which this was another really great piece of legislation that again had its limits. I mean, it outlawed, explicit, voter suppression, Jim Crow voter suppression, like outlawed, having to take a test, having to pay fees, having, all these different, poll taxes and stuff, that all these things that explicitly kept Black people away from the polls. And when that passed, this was arguably one of the more effective, legislation, because when it passed, all of a sudden we saw millions of Black people in the South get, all of a sudden start participating in voting, which, did not happen. I mean, before then. So, it was a huge bill. It was a powerful bill, but at the same time, it didn't really affect a lot of, from that, new versions of more race neutral versions of voter suppression emerged that it did not address. And this is stuff we're still seeing today, from political gerrymandering, voter ID laws. So voter ID laws, it seems very race neutral. You need an ID to vote. But when you look at who doesn't have an ID, who can't afford an ID or can't, has barriers like, from getting IDs, it's disproportionately, voters of color, and Republicans know this, so that's why they push these laws, because they know ultimately they're going to get more voters, and because there's going to be less, voters of color able to vote with voter ID laws, and then felon disenfranchisement that came right after the Civil War, when they're when the South was like trying to gain back power, and they're like, oh, what are all the ways that we can suppress Black people? Let's create all these Black laws and Jim Crow laws that target Black people, and then when they get thrown in jail, that's remove strip them of their right to vote. And that's still happening in like half our states. So there's still a lot of room for voter suppression that's still happening even today. And especially, I mean, we did a whole section on the it's called the VRA, the Voter Rights Act, but Section 5 was this, that was stripped in 2010 by the Republicans and the Republican Supreme Court. And that section basically said any state that had a past history of voting suppression against Black people, had to get federal approval for any kind of policy affecting, their elections, because they knew, they knew that, these Republican states and these conservative states were going to try to find some way around this law, and so this was like this fail-safe that to try to capture that, and they actually were able to remove that with the support of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, the final decision was basically like, racism doesn't really exist anymore, so we don't need this anymore, which is insane. And once they removed that, it was like within like an hour later, all of a sudden Texas and all these other states were passing, voter ID laws and stuff, because they didn't have to, get approval federally. And we saw, 30 to 40, voting suppression laws passed in the next year or two, and hundreds of thousands of voters of color were denied, their ability to vote. And this is still happening today. So even though the VRA was great, it left a lot of loopholes for a lot of neutral discrimination, race neutral discrimination. And then we had the then we had the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So this was an amazing piece of legislation. LBJ actually used, MLK, Dr. King's death to kind of push this through, as a big cause of why, there was all these, riots and uprisings and throughout the, 67, 68, hundreds of cities, were basically Black people living in poverty were fighting, rising up against police brutality and how, white supremacy, housing and things. So this was one of the bills that came out after Dr. King was assassinated, kind of used that momentum to push the Fair Housing Act. It basically outlaws explicit, housing discrimination. But at the same time, again, it leaves a lot of loopholes for a lot of, quotes, race neutral racism, like things like redlining and just, and all different kinds of like, explicit, housing discrimination where were outlawed, or some of them like redlining, it took another decade and some more legislation to officially get it outlawed, and in many ways it's still happening today, but just more de facto ways. But at the same time, it allowed for these like race neutral ways, like exclusionary zoning laws, where these white rich neighborhoods who want to keep stay white will pass these laws that saying all new developments have to be single family units, which are much more expensive than multi family units, which are that could qualify for affordable housing. So that so they're using the fact that they're white people have more wealth, like 16 times more wealth than Black people. They're using that reality to keep Black people out of their communities. And they could just be like, oh, it's just the market, or oh, we just like the facade of our community. We want it all to be single family units, but the outcome is racism. So Ibram Kendi has this really great quote, talking about, how about the racism that came after these bills. So as much as the Civil Rights Act served as, to erect a dam against Jim Crow policies, it also opened the floodgates for new racist ideas to pour in, including the most racist idea to date. It was an idea that ignored the white Head Start, presumed that discrimination had been eliminated, presumed that equal opportunity had taken over, and figured that since Blacks were still losing the race, the racial disparities and their continued losses must be their fault. Black people must be inferior, and equalizing policies like eliminating or reducing white seniority or instituting affirmative action policies would be unjust and ineffective. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 managed to bring on racial progress and progression of racism at the same time. All right. So I want to kind of play a really quick clip of Dr. King. Many people, we're taught a very whitewashed version of Dr. King. Our last episode, or our last class was on, whitewashing. We had a whole section on Dr. King. So you definitely check that out if you want to. You realize just how incredibly whitewashed his memory. Like Dr. King was a radical. He believed in reparations and economic and political, distribution of power. He eventually called his dream a nightmare, but we don't teach that. We teach that, essentially, or, I mean, I was taught essentially that, Dr. King had a dream. It was that, with that if everyone could just be nice to each other, and we could pass some civil rights bills, racism would be fixed. And that happened, and everything's fine. So that's the narrative I was taught. And in reality, though, it's important to understand, Dr. King beyond that. So I'm gonna play this clip where he talks just a little bit more about that.
I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead. And some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. Didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. Now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
All right. All right. So the last section I'm going to play, or the last slide I'm going to play, is kind of a quick overview of Nicole Hannah-Jones. Many people know about her from the 1619 Project, which was her, kind of her baby. But before that, she spent, a long time, I want to say, close to a decade, researching and covering school segregation, modern day school segregation. And she's written amazing articles and done amazing interviews. We're going to read and watch a lot of those during this class, especially when we get to the resegregation, sections. But she gives this presentation where she talks about a quick history of everything that we just talked about, but she kind of puts it all together in a way that kind of helps understand where we're going right now. So I'm going to play this clip really quickly before we jump into our next section, which is white resistance.
Thank you for bearing with me. So in 1954, the Supreme Court rules in Brown v. Board of Education. Brown v. Board is considered probably the most important ruling of the 20th century because overnight, and I think most of us probably don't understand how radical this ruling was. The Supreme Court had for more than 60 years sanctioned racial segregation. It had sanctioned racial apartheid as being legal under the Constitution. And so an entire society had structured with this understanding that it was perfectly fine to separate Black people in separate facilities in every aspect of American life. And overnight, 9 justices on the Supreme Court says that that can no longer stand, that the Constitution does not abide racial segregation. And though all of us in this room, I would imagine, have not known in America where that was not true, that was extremely radical. The way we tend to tell the story is the court rules, and then white America says, we were wrong for all these years. We totally get what you're saying now. We're going to sing Kumbaya, and we're going to go off in an equitable future together. And any segregation that's left is just because Black people are poor, they choose it. That's the way that we tend to tell the story. Of course, that's not actually the way that the story goes. This ruling was radical. The South rebels. The South says this is an illegitimate court. Southern congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto, which says this is not a legitimate court and we do not have to comply with the ruling of Brown. And they refuse. White Northerners, on the other hand, applaud the ruling because in white Northerners' mind, the ruling has nothing to do with them whatsoever. Because, of course, everyone knows there are no racism in the North. So the South launches massive resistance, and a full decade later, there's almost no desegregation, despite the Supreme Court ruling that segregation is illegal and unconstitutional, and that Black children have the right to attend integrated schools. And then something happens in 1964. A few things. Finally, the court gets tired of the resistance after a full decade. Now, keep in mind, we think about these things in legal abstractions. There are millions of Black children who suddenly have rights in 1954. And a decade later, most of those children are no longer in schools anymore, and they have not for a minute, for a second, gotten to live out the rights that they were guaranteed by the Constitution and by the courts. They continue in their segregated and unequal schools. In 1964, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act. We all know that the Civil Rights Act is the Public Accommodations Act that says you can no longer discriminate against people in public accommodations. What we don't know is that it also dealt with school segregation. And it gave the Justice Department the right to finally start suing school districts that were not complying with Brown. And so for the first time, you had the power of the federal government in enforcing Brown. At that same time, the federal government also vastly increases the amount of money that is going to school districts by the feds. And so between the carrot and the stick, you were going to be sued if you didn't comply with Brown, and you were going to lose money between those two things, you really saw the dominoes fall very, very quickly in the South. The court got serious. It started to say it wasn't enough to simply erase the law on the books that said schools could be segregated without actually integrating students, but that schools actually had to move students around and move teachers around. And so within 4 years, you see the dominoes fall, and within less than a decade, majority of Black children in the South are now attending integrated schools. Why does that history matter? Because what it tells you is when we got serious about desegregating and forcing integration the same way we had forced segregation, it actually worked. I'm going to take you through a couple of slides, and I want you to just take them in. This first picture here is Ruby Bridges. As you see, she's wearing these very cute bobby socks and carrying this very grown attaché case. And these nice white men who are flanking her are the US Marshals who had to stand with her and walk her through the angry white mob every day as this child, who at the time was just 5 years old, attempts to become the first white child or Black child to attend a white elementary school in the South. She required US Marshals and armed guard because white parents were so afraid of this single Black child ending in school that, by the way, her parents' tax dollars were also paying for. This picture here, these lovely mothers, I want you also to focus on almost all of these pictures. They are women and not men who are protesting these children coming into these schools. These mothers are carrying a casket that they have built and put a brown baby doll in that casket to send a message. They would march this around as Ruby Bridges was attempting to enter the school to send a message to this 5-year-old child that this is what would happen to her if they were able to get their hands on her. And I have a child who's 8, and I always think about my child when I look at this picture. And I think about what I have been brave enough as a parent to subject my baby to that in order to make a better world and force our country to live up to its democratic promises. That first semester of school, Ruby Bridges was in her classroom alone because every single white parent pulled their child out of the classroom. And it was just her and her teacher, a white woman who refused to bow to the pressure and not teach this baby. And I think about how isolating and sad that would have been for a child to have to walk through a mob every day only to go into a classroom and sit by herself, simply so that she could partake in the education that we have promised all children. Ruby Bridges, by the way, was in New Orleans. So New Orleans was the place of the first integrated elementary school in the South. This is Boston. Because I know, we up north like to look down at the South as if they're the ones who have the problem with race. The Supreme Court also ruled that the North had to comply with Brown, and that even though the North didn't write racial apartheid into its laws largely, the way that the North accomplished segregation was through policy and through housing. So housing in the North was much more segregated. You don't have to write laws to keep Black kids out of your schools and your pools and your restaurants if you just keep all Black people from moving into your neighborhood. But also what they found in places like Boston and New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, all of these cities, Detroit, were all placed under school desegregation orders because they found that what school boards did was they gerrymandered attendance zones. So they would draw maps that look just as crazy as congressional maps in order to keep schools all Black or all white. They built schools only in Black neighborhoods or white neighborhoods. They would allow all the white kids to transfer out of a school if it started to become a transitioning school. And so the courts found that the North actually was also implementing illegal and unconstitutional segregation and ruled that busing was going to be needed to accomplish integration because housing was so segregated. And white people acted in the North just like they did in the South. They violently resisted desegregation of their schools. These are white mothers in the North who were protesting very small desegregation efforts. We've all heard about busing. What most people don't want to discuss, though, is one, children have been riding buses for as long as there have been school buses. As long as there have been buses, children have ridden buses. Busing never became a problem until it was used for integration. And even today, tons of kids ride buses, just not for integration. People also forget or they don't know that Linda Brown, who was the lead plaintiff in Brown v. Board of Education, actually sued because she was forced to go to a school that was not her neighborhood school. She was forced to pass the white schools that were in her neighborhood in order to go to a black school, which was much further away. So there was no problem with only wanting neighborhood schools or not wanting busing until it became a tool for integration. So as they would say back then, it's not the bus, it's us. There's always been this sense that equality for Black people was somehow taking away something from white people. These are mothers bringing their children out to protest Black kids trying to enter a school. These, of course, are some of the famous pictures of National Guardsmen having to be called out in order to ensure the safety of Black kids in Little Rock, Arkansas, who are attempting to integrate Central High School. Of course, if you go to Central High School now, it's completely Black because all of the white children were simply pulled out of school. All of these kids, there was usually only a handful of Black kids who were being tasked with entering these schools, and they were also very carefully picked to ensure that they had, quote unquote, the highest moral character. Yet even so, these kids were taunted, they were abused, and they were prevented from entering these schools. This picture is also in the north. This is in Syracuse. If we look at these pictures, these are all approximately 1960s. These are your grandparents. These are some of the people in this room. Where did those people go? Did they have a transformation? Or did they pass on that same hatred and animus to their children who perhaps have passed it on to you? So we see when forced by the courts, the South becomes completely transformed. Most of us tend to think of the South as the most segregated. The South has not been the most segregated region of the country for 50 years. Who'd like to guess what's the most segregated region of the country? The Northeast and the Midwest. Find your industrial city that Black people migrated to during the Great Migration from the South, and you will find your most segregated cities in the country. Because the North could afford to pretend to be racially egalitarian as long as there were no Black people up here. And as soon as Black people moved to the North, white people in the North began to react the same way the Southerners did. And in fact, during desegregation of the South, white Southerners would laugh at the North and they'd say, "You watch. Once they start coming there, you're going to act just like us." And that's exactly what happened. The thing is that desegregation actually works. I don't know how clear this photo is, but these are third grade reading scores on national assessments. What you'll see is there was a 40-point gap between white and Black reading scores in the early 1970s, which is when we first began to do these national assessments. And within only 15 years of real desegregation, we saw that achievement gap cut in half. It actually produced what all of these other reforms that we've implemented have said that they will do, but have not done on scale. And then something happens in 1988. If you look at the test scores, we see that that gap starts to widen in 1988. 1988 is when we start to see the reversal of desegregation. It lines up perfectly. For a variety of reasons, there's a white backlash. As school desegregation starts moving to the north, the white liberal congressmen who supported civil rights as long as it was penalizing the South and making the South behave suddenly began to balk once it became a part of the North. Joe Biden, for instance, a lot of people don't know that he opposed busing for integration, and that he helped tuck into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a provision that made it very difficult to desegregate schools in the North unless you had a court order. Reagan began to close out school desegregation orders, and there was a general backlash because if there's one thing that's consistent about our country is we have very little tolerance for racial progress. We will have fits and starts of Black people and other communities of color pushing very hard for progress, and there will be breakthroughs, and then we will find an immediate retrenchment. And if you need a more contemporary example, just look at what happened after the election of the first Black president. If you look at this graph, what we see is that despite rapid desegregation peaks in 1988, and even though Black children have never been more than approximately 18% was the highest, and typically Black folks never been more than 15% of the population of the United States. There's never been a single point in time where even half of Black kids have attended a majority white school in a majority white country. What that tells you is that this is intentional, and that there's always been an understanding that you cannot deprive Black children of a quality education if they're sitting in the classrooms with white kids. Because then, in order to deprive them, you have to deprive your own children. So in the North, we actually saw very little desegregation. The first test of whether Brown could be applied to the North that goes before the Supreme Court occurred in 1974 in Detroit. By this time, we no longer have the liberal Warren Court, we have the Nixon Court, and Nixon appoints 4 conservative justices who rule against a metro-wide desegregation plan in the North and makes it pretty much impossible to desegregate Northern schools. And so since that time, Northern schools have remained deeply segregated, and your great state of Rhode Island doesn't look good. In fact, you can look at any one of your blue states, and the segregation for Black children is amongst the worst. New York State, most segregated state in the country for Black kids. New Jersey, second most segregated state in the country for Black kids. California, most segregated state for Latino kids. These are Democratic states.